Hello. Welcome to In Bed with Books, the podcast where we talk about smutty fantasy, classics, and more. My name is Melissa.
And I'm Bethany. If you'd like to find more of us, you can find us on our website, inbedwithbookspod.com, YouTube for video versions of the podcast, or wherever you pod on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
If you want to see us outside of the podcast, then head over to Instagram and follow us at In Bed with Books Pod.
Thanks for being here. Let's jump right in.
And again, that's it.
Yeah.
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 Yep. Okay.
Okay. How is your summer coming along? How is your hair coming along?
It's so humid. I feel like I'm wearing a second head of hair. It took me so long just to get it up in like a bun because it's twice as big as usual. The humidity is at, I can only assume, like a solid 175%. So I feel like I am swimming. Yep.
Gross. I was looking at the map recently and I realized just how close Houston is to the Gulf.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We're only like 30 minutes, like a 30-minute drive.
Yeah. It's no wonder. It's a swamp.
Quite literally, it's just like Louisiana where it's literally a swamp. We have built on top of a swamp.
Yeah.
That's why every time there's a big storm, it floods like that.
Yeah.
Because there's nowhere for the water to go. The water table is already so high. But also it is so hot that I don't know how much of the water in the air is humidity and how much of it is just the sweat that I'm producing.
Yeah.
At this point. So that's where I'm
heat.
at. Yes.
Oddly enough, for me, I think summer's become my new favorite season.
That's disgusting.
I know. I'm so against
I heavily
everything.
cannot relate to that right now. I'm so happy for you.
I know, but I think honestly it's because I've always majority of my life I've lived halfway between Seattle and Portland.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit closer to the coast than Seattle is, even though Seattle's on the Puget Sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's still you still have the Olympics that kind of keep you from the sea,
mm-hmm.
temperaments. So in Centralia, I feel where I used to live, it was it rains more there. I've moved to Seattle and I'm it really doesn't rain as often as I'm used to. I'm wow,
That's
because
so funny.
It's so weird. And of course it still rains in Seattle. It still rains a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm oh, actually it doesn't as much as what I'm used to, what I thought, right? Then the summers are incredible. We haven't had a day over 90. We had, it gets 50, 40s, 50s at night. It's really nice. And people move here for the fucking summers. And I'm starting to understand
actively trying to not make my face angry right now.
Yeah, it's okay.
I failed.
You're
there
allowed
for a minute.
to be
I
angry.
saw my face and I was work it out, Melissa. Work it out.
Yeah, it's and Seattle's nice because you get a breeze from you're surrounded by bodies of water. There's Lake Union, there's Lake Washington, there's the Sound, there's rivers and shit. But I go down to this park on Washington, Lake Washington, every day I can, just to go sit in the sun and then swim in a lake, which you know how I feel about swimming in bodies of water, and you can see and feel.
See, that's all I ask.
Yeah, I was I can see
Let me see the bottom.
And it's a big lake.
Yeah.
And you get lots of mountain streams coming through this lake. It's getting filtered. It's good. So I feel good about it. It's not a cesspool.
Yeah.
Some lakes.
If I know that there's movement in the lake, I can get into it, even if it's a little dark. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just need to know that there's it's not just sitting there. It's not still water,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
My family used to go up to Tahoe during the summer. Not every summer, but every few summers we'd go out there. And I mean, it's right in the name. It's a lake. But there was this one beach that we found that the water was just beautiful. Like you could see down it was almost enclosed. It was one of the nicer beaches. And so you could go out about like 30 feet into this water and you was still only about waist high.
Yeah.
And you could see all the way to the bottom.
Yeah.
And there was like rocks. And so you could like climb up on the rocks. And it was like this like tiny little like water park within it.
Yeah.
But like that is a very exclusive instance where I'm like, yeah, I'll swim in a lake. I'll do that one. Otherwise, I think back to like, okay, so when I was abroad as a freshman, I went to Cyprus and we would spend the weekends at the beach because it was right there. I mean, it was literally like a 10-minute walk. And I must have been like week 3 that I was out there. I looked down and it finally kind of settled that I couldn't see to the bottom of where I was walking. And I think my soul like left my body for a solid 30 seconds because I was like, we can't panic right now. This is because I was also like surrounded by people that were, I don't want to say like much older than me, but they were all like in their late 20s, early 30s. And so I was like, we're not going to be the nerd right now.
Yeah.
We're fine. It's okay. We're safe, Melissa. Look at how many people are swimming right now. There's nothing in the water. And if there is, why would it get you? There's no reason that it would need to get you. So I couldn't even fully convince myself that there wasn't anything in the water, but I could convince myself that I was uninteresting enough that it wouldn't get me.
Yeah.
Which is a terrible thing to have to do to yourself. But yeah, I grew up similarly placed, like surrounded by lakes in Michigan. And we had like St. Clair, and that was the kind of situation where like it's not really filtered. It's like you've got the Great Lakes. It's like a small lake kind of off of that. And so it was really stagnant because it wasn't connected to the Great Lakes. It didn't have its own tides.
Yeah.
And during the summers, like one day you'd be swimming in it, and then the next day it'd be closed for E. coli.
Gross. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, that's actually disgusting.
I've heard that about
we
Lake
all did
Erie
it, but
as well. I've heard Lake Erie.
I don't really know about Lake Erie. I wasn't really close to that one.
Yeah.
I don't think. I don't.
It's bad.
I don't know. Actually, I'm gonna look it up real quick because it's gonna bother me.
And then seawater is just so harsh. I remember when I went to Croatia and we were like, well, we have to. It was like so hot, and we were like, well, we have to like jump in the water, and it was just beautiful, and it was really like we jumped in, but then like my fucking hair, I was like, I can't do this. And it's bleached, like it's so hard on your hair. And I was like, I can't brush it, like I have to wash it like 3 times. It's really, and of course it's all hard water. And yeah.
I prefer seawater though to like fresh water if I'm gonna swim in it, because seawater, like, it revives you. Because if you got like cuts and stuff, it'll clean that shit out. I have like,
and you're like all slippery afterwards, like from the salt.
Yeah. I've got what is it, like upper respiratory issues because I've had asthma like my whole life, and like bad pollen allergies and everything. But every time I go to the beach, like to the ocean beach, I feel fucking revived. Like it opens my lungs. It feels so nice.
Yeah.
So even if I can't go in it, it is nice to go to the beach to like feel that.
Yeah.
A sea breeze is just, it's healing. I get what like the romantics were talking about when they were like, well, we have to go to Italy to correct our humors and the vapors and all of that shit. So I get it.
Okay. What are we talking about today, Melissa?
We are talking about different kinds of magic powers that show up in fantasy novels and books and romance.
And romance.
Yeah. So at this point, we have read quite a bit of fantasy, and we've gotten like, I don't want to say the biggest range when it comes to the kind of like diversity, because we have consistently read kind of similar creatures, but there's so many variations within that that I think it will be interesting to look at and answer some of the questions that we've got lined up for today.
Yes. We were trying to think of like how to like what kind of powers there are, and like what they're like attached to, like, you know, you hear about like elemental powers, or like telepathy or compulsion, like mind powers, and then you also have like shape shifting, and but then there's like ones that are connected to like what they are, right? Like witches like witches have like a really specific all of their power is connected to the land. Some,
well, like, because witches are magical,
yes,
like in a very traditional sense, whereas like other creatures like fae or vampires, it tends to kind of be subsidiary to what their actual like type is. So
yeah,
I feel like there can be more variation with witches than
there's like more
there tend to
freedom.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we were talking kind of about fae powers, which is very much I would you argue that like fae powers tend to be more hierarchical?
Yeah.
Because of the structure of like their world and courts and stuff. Like Reese is the most powerful, and so that's what I was gonna say earlier. It came to me.
Oh, okay, good. What was it?
We can kind of touch on maybe like powers connected to objects.
Okay, yeah.
Like for example, with Reese, when Amryn was like, "Well, you have the sword. You could now be like king of Prithian or whatever." Whereas he couldn't do that without the sword, and like this compounding of like,
I think he arguably could be.
Yeah.
But like if he were to take the sword, it wouldn't even be a choice of yes or no. It would be.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking of like the Philosopher's Stone. That's like an object in history, like I guess like myth, or whatever you want to say, that is tied to magic. Also like Excalibur.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think like the thing with the objects too is that they tend to symbolize this very specific essence. Like Excalibur is very explicit. It was like whoever wields the sword is the one true king of Albion.
Yeah.
So it's not even like a debate on what that symbolizes. Whereas like the Philosopher's Stone, you kind of have the like superficial, this is for eternal life, but then you have like the quote unquote moral of the story, which is it's unattainable because eternal life is unattainable. So you know what I mean?
Yeah. Other things are like the fountain of youth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
it's this thing you're just gonna keep searching for. It's a myth. In like the very literal sense of like it's a myth, but also like what it represents is a myth.
Yeah.
The ability to stop time for yourself is you can quite literally search for that for the rest of your life. And we see people in their like midlife crises doing that when they're buying the sports car or like getting the hot new wife who's 20 years younger, but in reality they're going to keep chasing it and never attain it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think objects are this very like quite literally symbolic element within fantasy. What's another one? The one true ring, the ring of power.
Oh god, yeah.
Yes.
Big
yes one. Oh yeah, huge one. Within Narnia, each of the kids kind of had their own little symbol. So when they first get to Narnia, they get these gifts from Santa. Don't ask me why Lewis threw Santa in there. He felt that it was imperative to the story. I am with Tolkien on this one. I feel like it was a little maybe outlandish even for fantasy.
Yeah.
but they each get a gift from him. And so when they come back in the sequel, and I'm talking based on the movies, I don't remember how the books were lined up order wise, but when they come back for the sequel, they find those gifts and are recognized once again as the kings and queens of Narnia, like 1300 years later. So it becomes this symbol within Narnia of them as rulers.
Right.
And like, let's see, Lucy had a tonic that could heal any wound, just short of death. And she's the young one. She's the one that's meant to keep their hope alive, that helps connect them to Aslan. So that's that very kind of like restorative nature of Lucy's character. Whereas Susan, the older sister, got a bow and arrow. And her whole thing is being like super like what's the word? Logical and precise and like cutting things down. And so like the bow and arrow feels very much like that kind of cutting energy, more so than like a sword, which is meant to represent like strength and royalty, you know what I mean? So yeah,
God, that really reminds me of in Lord of the Rings, the gift Galadriel gives the Fellowship.
Oh yeah, I mean that's huge in fantasy and like fairy stories, let's just say, which both of them were basing these off of. These two, that's why I think it's hard to mention, for me it's hard to mention one without the other, because they were so imperative to the way that fantasy has grown into what it is today, in two very different ways. It's like Joseph Campbell's the hero's journey, because you get the part after the heroes have accepted what they need to do, where they get the gifts from the magic person who just kind of like enters the story and then exits after the gifts are given. Okay,
I'm trying to think if there's, I think we covered that one. That's a good, because there's I feel like ACOTAR, the way in which ACOTAR uses objects feels really casual to me.
Same.
Because it's like something's just going to exist that someone read in a book one day that might be able to help, or there's like rumor of this thing and then it gets used and then no one cares about it anymore, and it's just very kind of, I would say, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, it feels unclear sometimes on what each of their individual purposes are. Just because for the most part, it just feels like they're super powerful, but like for what? For anything. They're just power, you know? Like, we were led to believe that it was just the cauldron that was. And then suddenly there's the death trove. Where also they are like that in the exact same way. Which is
and then
that,
the books, like those books, and then it's like,
it's like, well, it's just power. It's like, okay, I don't hate that entirely. I do kind of prefer when the objects are kind of like the Philosopher's Stone, where it's like it serves a very distinct purpose, and it's a very specific symbol that we can use for the story. Whereas like ACOTAR is just power.
In ACOTAR, I feel like, maybe this isn't her strongest suit in writing like Moss, is that like it really felt like she just needed something to kind of put in place a plot, which I'm not complaining about at all, because it is like a way of using objects and stuff. But I don't have any kind of like reverence for these objects, which I feel like in other stories there's a bit more.
Like the build up for the ring in Lord of the Rings
insane.
You get
a whole like history, there's a whole history attached
to this very specific object, and you can see the way that it influences, and you can like there's a specific way that it's supposed to be used, but it's only this one, and so this one object is extremely special, and like
the political
obviously
implications of it as well, like how he gave the 9 rings to the men, and like of all of these like the politics that were associated with these objects is interesting.
Whereas like obviously we're balls deep and Sarah J. Maas stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say like this is like a huge issue for me, but it does feel kind of like the dead trove.
Yeah.
Dead. I had
Dread
just
Trove, I don't know.
I feel like I just watched Princess Bride, so I feel like Dread Trove might just be Dread Pirate Roberts like trying to vomit out of my mouth. But oh shoot, hold on. I'm doing the hamster fall off the wheel. One second. What was I saying? Yes. Okay. I feel like it was kind of a cop out to have it just like, well, the objects have chosen to be forgotten and we're just remembering now because of Nesta.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's how
like
it felt.
Calls I was like, to like. Yeah.
Yeah, like that just felt like a very easy explanation to suddenly remember these things like that. Especially, and I think it's because having read it after reading Crescent City, you can see all of the like seeds that she's planting for the crossover with these two things.
Yeah.
And so I think that's also why the introduction of these objects that just conveniently wanted to be forgotten and are suddenly wanting to be remembered is so like it just really sticks out. It's kind of jarring for the rest of the story sometimes.
Yeah, and I can see her kind of improving upon this now in Crescent City.
Yeah.
Like she's a little bit more like intentional about the objects.
With the horn, like that was a very specific thing with a very specific purpose.
Yes.
But it doesn't like this, the coincidence isn't lost on me because there's also a horn in Lord of the Rings and in Narnia.
Yeah.
Just kind of going back to these two things, like setting the stage for fantasy as we know it today.
Yeah.
And in like the horn in these kinds of stories symbolizes like if we're going to use it as an archetype, it's the call to arms.
Yeah.
So I like that she got a little bit more specific with what the objects were, their intended use is, I guess I could say.
One thing I feel like, to move on from objects a bit.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I feel like one thing that I find really interesting is when authors decide to use, see, I said it earlier to,
yeah.
The hamster is gone now.
Yeah, I know.
He's nowhere to be found.
I think it's the heat, dude. Like more and more the last couple of weeks, I'll start a thought.
Yeah.
And then I get halfway through and I'm like, it's gone.
Yeah.
I don't know where it went. It's
gone forever.
Flew out my mouth without the sound. Yep.
Yeah. What I'm trying to explain though is in Serpent and Dove, when Lou, there's that incredible scene that I'll just like never forget because it was so good. I really want to like listen to the series again. I just forgot how much I love it. But there's that scene, I think it's in Blood and Honey, where she's in the pub and she's like throwing a dagger and she's using her magic. And of course with witches, like you're using the space around you, you're using like the earth to in exchange for something, right? So you have to take something away to gain something else. So she takes like the wind out from her in order to like shoot this arrow at like the bad guy. And I like it when authors, I guess I found it was such a great, there was a lot in that scene that was showing you just how reckless Lou was being.
Yeah.
And that was like a good example of like, she hasn't been training because she's been hiding her magic because magic has smell, which is another cool thing that I fucking loved about that story, was that like magic has a smell and you have to like cover it.
You're gonna love the Hollows, dude.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love the use of smell just in books generally. So
yes, same.
Like phase, heightened smell and stuff.
Well, I guess like kind of popping off of that as well is like, I wouldn't say that all like witch stuff uses that like magic has a price, but I think that's one of the first times that I've seen it be like a very literal kind of 1-for-1 price. So like speaking of the hollows, which was on my mind for this reason, so there is a price that she pays for that, for magic, because there's, in the hollows, there's a few different kinds of magic. And what is deemed black magic, if you do black magic, you'll get like a smudge on your aura. And so you can't always see your aura. Even like if you have the ability to see, you kind of have to like squint and like look with your third eye kind of situation. I think she calls it her second sight. But that's kind of like eventually, like, it's slight spoiler, but again, because I know you don't really mind spoilers, is like she has a really hard time with it at first. She's just a green witch to begin with. She does like potions and stuff because she's like, I don't want any smudges on my soul. I don't want to deal with that, because there's like this secondary kind of implication of what does that mean for me to have a smudge on my soul. But slowly she kind of gets over that a little bit, like book by book. So it's not even immediate. Like I think the end of the first book is just that climax for her character is just her deciding to do a very, very small spell that'll leave just like the smallest of smudges on her. Like it's not even that big. And then by the very end, she's just covered in it, because she's realized that it's actually bullshit. And like, what is the smudge even? Right. Like what is it? Whereas in Serpent and Dove, like you said, like in that scene specifically, because I think about that shot as well, when she like knocks the wind out of herself to do this one shot, and then she just keeps fighting.
Yeah.
Like she doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
She, what is it? Like, Reed gets rid of his memories of her.
Yes.
To cast a spell. Like that's a huge price to pay.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah. And even in The Cruel Prince, Vivi and Vivi and Heather.
Vivi.
Like wanting to like take away her like memories and stuff, like which Jude is just like, that's not a good idea, because like there's just a terrible idea.
And that one's less like the universe needing to balance itself kind of price, and more like the kind of like the karmic, like human price, quote unquote, because Vivi's not human, but like price that you pay through magic. And it wasn't the magic of trying to get her to forget, but the price that she's having to pay for like glamoring her, or not glamour, I can't remember, like doing the geese or whatever it is on her at the party. Like that's the price that she's having to pay for that. So all of that to say that the way the authors can toy with that idea of like the price of magic is, I think, really interesting, because it really reflects something that's necessary within the story, like you said, like needing to show Lou's recklessness, or in the instance of the hollows, like needing to break through this kind of structure of what you think something is supposed to be, like the shame that you give yourself, or that's been like thrust upon you because of some outside institution that really doesn't have a say, so
like Lou, I found that world to be incredibly like harsh because of that. Like everything has a price, then like what's the point of using magic, but it's such a huge part of their life, that it's really about it's like honing it and learning how, like, not just training like the power itself, but like about thinking on the spot of like what to do. Like, because there's also that battle that she has with Reed, where he's like pushing her buttons, and she like pushed him too far, and like she actually made a mistake in that moment, like
yes. And I think the thing is too, like in those books we're seeing a very isolated kind of situation, because the witches that are using magic in that book are not using it the way that she is typically. It's like they give up a little bit of heat in their body to light a fire. That is typical like witches for their world. It's not giving up all of the air in their lungs to stab somebody across the room. So I think also like the idea or like our perception of that being a little harsh is directly related to the fact that it's meant to feel scary because we're seeing it from Lou's point of view.
Yeah.
So
yeah, very
okay.
interesting.
Yes. So we, and by we I mean you, had kind of divided things into like different sections, and two of the big kind of like circles that could be a Venn diagram that I liked were powers that like are inherent, that are given, or not given, sorry, like powers that are like inherited biologically versus like powers that are earned through something, acquired later. Yeah, because I feel like there is such like a vast difference between kind of what those can look like.
Yeah.
Or I guess like what those end up kind of feeling like. So on the one side of this, in the like powers that are inherent, I would say is like witches and fae for the most part. Obviously the Archon sisters are outliers. But like on the opposite end of that, you have things that are like people that are turned into magic creatures, which are like vampires and shapeshifter, like werewolves. I will say generally,
and the Archeron sisters.
And the Archeron sisters, yeah. Like generally speaking, I think shapeshifters can go on either side, but I'm thinking specifically of like werewolves. So like if we look at vampires, traditionally speaking, vampires have this wide range of powers, but the powers are all meant to like confuse humans because they are this like predator of humans, right? I think specifically vampires are the only ones that are a predator, because I wouldn't consider werewolves even to be, because werewolves are kind of unwilling. They like turn on the full moon and they don't know what they do under the full moon. They aren't doing anything actively. Whereas like vampires as this symbol are kind of this threat in the night. There isn't like the solution for defeating a vampire is just to kill it. Whereas like in some cultures, when you wanted to defeat a werewolf, it would have to be like the matriarch of the family would have to call their name so many times from the back porch of their family home and like present them with like a piece of cloth, like weird shit like that.
Yeah.
But it's possible to like overcome a werewolf's shift, whereas it's only possible to kill a vampire because a vampire is meant to be predator, and so their powers are directly connected to needing to trick humans, so like compulsion, turning into different animals. I guess it could fall under compulsion, but like making them hallucinate. So like different forms of like telepathy and shit like that. And even though we don't always see like a vampire being made, the presence of a vampire implies the presence of a sire, which implies like a lineage. You know what I mean? Like you aren't born a vampire for the most part.
You're made one. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So you acquire those powers at a later date, and then choose, I guess, how you decide to go about that. But at the end of the day, you still have the powers.
There's also in like From Blood and Ash, which I feel like is really unique in that like you turn into a different, what do you call it, like a species essentially,
I guess
that like we'll just call it that. And remind me, because you start somewhere and then you end up somewhere else, depending on what blood you're eating, drinking.
I don't even know.
I can't
at
remember
this point. Because at first I remember they weren't really sure what she had, because there was one type of Atlantean that could control emotions, and that's what they assumed she was at first. But she was like, you'd have to be from a really old family or like have somehow crossed like one half blood with like another half blood to somehow create a full-blooded one on accident, basically. But it was basically that like they were all vampires, or like I guess quote unquote vampires, but they all had different powers. Whereas I don't even really know what his power is other than strength, maybe.
Castiel.
Yeah.
Well, he has compulsion too.
Yes, and I feel like they mentioned that that's also not common.
Yeah. Yeah.
For like he's an elemental.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Whatever I think that's what they named him, or like their like species of vampire. Their subspecies. But other than that, like I feel like they're kind of a bland strain of vampire compared to some of the other ones that they talk about.
Yeah.
Like some of the other
like
powers
Craven. Like Craven is like when you like eat too much or something.
Well, no, because like the Craven are when, or anytime that the like
blood.
Yeah, well, it's when the like the nobles from the old world, anybody that they bit turned into a Craven.
Right.
So her like the Duke and Duchess, like what do they turn into again? What's the name for theirs? They're like soulless.
I know.
And they can't go out in the sun. Yeah. But the thing is, like, they're not real.
There's vampire.
Yes. And so the thing is, they're not real vampires.
Right.
Because of what we found on the last one is that they are the product of like Isbith's corruption. Right. Because she is like essentially like this kind of Frankenstein monster version of a god who's not a real god. She's a false god.
Yeah.
And then she would use their blood to like use the Atlantean blood to morph the nobles into vampires, which are false ones, which create the Craven. But even like within Atlantia, they would get like there used to be the ones that could shapeshift into dragons.
Right.
Or you could have ones that like that could change their face, because remember they used that to trick her at the end of book 2.
Mm-hmm.
And almost killed her that way. So yeah, I'm just like, how did the Deniers gain power when they don't even have like that killer of like a power or abilities?
Yeah, because it does seem like, I mean, just being an Atlantean was really a lot in the first book, like because you can you heal really fast, and you're really fast and you're really strong. But that's also not, we're just comparing this to Poppy, like, and we don't even know what she is. So it's like it's a very like I think we're still learning, what everything is and how it is. So it's interesting.
And like, what are the limits of their powers?
Yeah. Because
again, like one of the, I would say, difficulties of most of the series being told from Poppy's point of view is that we don't know shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've kind of talked about that before, is like the mental walls that she'll put up to protect herself, which makes sense, like the shit that she's been through. But like, even now that we're getting all of these answers, all it does is create more questions, and it doesn't explain what the literal limits of her power is. Because now that we've even seen like Nyktos and Sarah, so many more questions about like again what these limits are, and like, not to see like, well, like where does it end, but I mean like, what are like the actual parameters and the rules to these? And like, because we don't see their full power, because sometimes we'll see Nyktos like appear in a room in his full godly essence, like through a puff of smoke, and just like wielding intense power. And then we're also kind of like, now we know that Poppy is kind of at that level because of like the things that came together to make her. But the biggest thing in like the end of book 1 that we knew was just that she was bit by Craven and she didn't turn into Craven. And you're like, wow, that's super lucky for her.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, she's actually a god.
Yeah.
So that's why.
Yeah. So now when we go back and read it again, we'll be like, oh yeah, Of
That makes so
course.
much sense. Yeah. Those
Duh.
books are so big. I don't know if I'll ever read them for a second time. I
I
might
mean,
have to if
I'd
I
love
have,
to listen to like that. I like
yes,
rereading by listening. Yeah.
I could listen to it. But I think that's the thing is like now, and I would argue that that's the direction the series is taking at this point, because we've got this kind of second round of answers around the prophecy thanks to the prequel series. And the direction that it's taking at this point in the original series, which is the issue now is like first and foremost Nick Jose's uncle, whose name I can't remember, the primal of life, who used to be the primal of death, who stole it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
it's been a long time coming, but I feel like we're getting answers to some of these questions.
Yeah,
and we're going to see the full scope of Poppy's powers.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
There was another topic though I think we should cover.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were talking earlier, I was thinking about like Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
And they all go to school.
Yeah.
And they're all on even playing ground.
Yeah.
You know, like everyone is going, but then there still seems to be a hierarchy of like who's the most powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Still, which I find is interesting. I guess whatever you would call it, talent.
I think that's the interesting thing about like Harry Potter, because on the one hand, it's meant to all kind of be like this, like an allegory for the Holocaust, and you've got like purebloods versus like, pardon my French, mudbloods. But then you've also got these very specific characters who are kind of extremely powerful, and it's unclear if there is anything beyond just like luck around that. Because as much as Voldemort was pushing pure blood, witches and wizards, and don't mix bloods with other species and all of that shit, his father was a mortal or a muggle. And so it's very like, and he was in his own right, I won't deny that, in his own right, like a very powerful wizard.
Yeah.
And so that in and of itself disproves the kind of like racial issues that he was trying to raise. But it also can't be ignored that on the other end, like the pinnacle of power within the resistance, Dumbledore was also in his heyday kind of like a wizard white supremacist.
Right.
And he was like involved with Grindelwald and tried to do their own muggle war when they were younger.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. And that's all like, that's kind of mentioned in the books when we get the history. I want to say in the 7th book we learn more about that. And I still like, I feel like it was an interesting artistic choice to decide to do that for a children's book. But
yeah,
I wouldn't say that she's the best at making decisions to begin with. So
yeah,
I don't think it's really like a mystery of why that happened.
Yeah.
But I mean, case in point, Lily Potter, on multiple occasions is quoted by other people as being one of the brightest witches of her age, and she's a mudblood. And not even like how one magic parent and one muggle parent. Like she was one of the kinds of kids that kind of pops out of two seemingly muggle parents. So yes, I do find it interesting that Harry Potter is having that conversation and then still kind of like falling into like the trap of still in some way like identifying it in a couple of characters, you know?
Yeah, like I was kind of thinking like Harry is supposed to be he's supposed to be powerful, if not as powerful as Voldemort. So it's like the chosen one, right? But Hermione's like powerful because she's also smart.
Yeah.
And Ron is powerful because he's loyal. I don't know. Like,
yeah.
you
But
know,
like, and Ron's powerful because he's been around magic his entire life.
Yes.
That's how he thinks.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas like Harry and Hermione have to kind of retrain their brains to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that does bring up another point too, is like, it's not just witches and wizards there, but the house elves are, I feel like the house elves get brought up a lot, but I would argue also like the centaurs in their world. And then like the dwarves, any creature that for whatever reason can be deemed more powerful than witches and wizards at some point have been like pushed under their boot.
Yes.
So like the house elves are stuck in this kind of servitude, and are not allowed wands. And the dwarves, similarly so. I don't know. I don't think they're allowed wands, but it doesn't seem to stop them because the few times that we see them in the movies and in the books, they have like no problem using magic at all. So on the one hand, you get like, look at this like pseudo Hitler. That's bad. Don't think like that. But also, we're not going to solve the issue of quote unquote lesser species being enslaved.
Yeah, it's like there's also systemic like issues
that I'm not going to solve.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Yeah. Yep. But that does remind me too, I think another one that kind of fell under the Venn diagram that I was mentioning earlier, and I'd be interested to see how you would categorize it, but powers that like spawn up when you hit a certain age. Just like Poppy was an example that we had talked about in our kind of like pre-recording.
Yeah.
Where like you go through the culling at like 17 to 20, and that's when your powers pop up. How would you say that's something that's inherent or acquired?
Well, it is inherent because you can't avoid it, right?
That's true. Yeah.
But it behaves kind of like that because it's like because you start out from without it and then you acquire it. So it's kind of interesting. Sense. But it would be like, if you were bit by a vampire, that's not something you.
Yeah.
It's either something you choose or not, right?
Yeah.
But if you're like born as something you don't really get to choose.
I would say that a lot. Like, I feel like I read a lot more fantasy like that when I was younger, but I can't remember quite a lot of it. I do remember Percy Jackson was like that. And so like the whole premise is they're demigods. And when they hit puberty is when the monsters, like the Greek monsters, can like smell their godly blood. They're like whatever mother or father, godly parent has helped make them. And so that's like they have to hide suddenly, like they have this world thrust upon them depending on how open their parents have been about it. So like Percy's mom didn't really tell her or tell him that his dad was the god of the sea, the Greek god of the sea, Poseidon. And so when he turns 13 and like his teacher turns into a harpy and attacks him, he doesn't know what to do. And like, suddenly he's finding out like he has these powers, and this like pen turns into an awesome sword, and slowly but surely like, oh, I've been able to hold my breath underwater for a very long time. Is that why? Like these little details start to make sense. So like I feel like that is definitely its own category, its own fun category of fantasy. So
there is this one series that I've read, which I feel like the magic is very interesting. It is a reverse harem. Okay. And she knows that she is powerful. She has these powers. And I forget what they are. It's been a while since I read it. But she has to regularly expend energy. So she like runs a lot. And then when she, finds all these guys, she can also expend that energy in other ways. Isn't that funny?
That's
but
convenient.
It's like a very integral part of like her like magical.
I feel like that goes into our conversation about like the powers and the ways that the authors use that
Yes.
as like a plot point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's great. That's fantastic.
Isn't that great?
That does also remind me though of like if we want to bring a little bit of sci-fi into this, is the different way that like superhero powers can show up. So I was thinking specifically of the X-Men, because the X-Men obviously has a much larger variation in powers than say like the Avengers.
Yeah.
It's just a larger team that is generally speaking, so that is kind of just the name of the game. But like there's not a typical way that it shows up. So you'll have like Professor X, who's got his wicked mind powers, but at the same time you've got Magneto, who can control metal. Both kind of different forms of telepathy, but like very different ends of the spectrum. But then at the same time you'll get like Wolverine, who is a science experiment, whose power is basically that he's made of metal and nearly indestructible. Like that's not a mind power. That's like, if we want to get into some specifics, some like when you have abilities, you either have body-based abilities or mind-based abilities. And so body ones would be like shape-shifting.
Right.
Or you've got wings.
Or you can or you can fly, or you can like winnow or something.
Or you can like breathe underwater.
Right.
Or like based around these things. Or you have mind powers, which like vampires can kind of fall into that because they'll get compulsion.
Yeah.
And then witches can sometimes fall into that because it is like their will doing something. It is not changing, generally speaking, like it's not changing themselves in any way. It's not like they aren't giving themselves super strength. My favorite conversation that I've had about this had to do with Jessica Jones. She was a Marvel superhero that had the show on Netflix. I have seen that one. I fucking love that show so much.
Good show.
And so like part of the reason that I like that show is because generally speaking, that this is not a hard and fast rule. Generally speaking, when women in superhero or like sci-fi or even fantasy stuff have powers, they're very rarely based around bodily and like strength kinds of things. And if they are, like, they've got to be a tomboy, you know, they aren't traditionally feminine.
Yeah.
But when they are given this like this space to be kind of like have ownership, like there's this kind of like fear around having a woman who has super strength, because she can say no. And so that's one of the reasons that I love that her villain in the first season is this guy who can compel you to do these things just by his voice. Because it kind of flipped the like, he's not abusing her with his body. He doesn't have to, because he's got the manipulative, he's got the mind powers to like make her do that. So yeah, one of my favorite examples of kind of like subverting
we really like that show. Yeah.
Also, rumor has it, and this is a rumor at this point, so if this is like confirmed that it's not true by the time this come out, then I cannot vouch for that. But there's gonna be so the long way to this, in case anyone's curious, but the long path to this is that this past winter we just had the Hawkeye show, which introduced like basically what's going to be Hawkeye's replacement in the MCU. And one of the villains in that show is getting her own spinoff because she's a really interesting character. And it's been confirmed that Matt Murdock is going to come back, the guy who played Daredevil, and Kingpin, the guy that he fought in Daredevil. And apparently, part of their whole thing is going to be looking for like an old ally of Matt Murdock. And rumor has it that it's Jessica Jones.
Ooh.
Yes, which is exciting because for a hot minute there, Marvel was like, actually, all of our Netflix shows are no longer canon. So those aren't part of our sphere anymore. Our universe, and everyone kind of threw a fit. And I think they corrected it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were like, actually, no, they are. We were kidding. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Honey.
Another reason to potentially rewatch Jessica Jones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this. Like, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think like I think we covered like a lot in terms of like I find From Blood and Ash to be like a really unique way of using powers in terms of like turning people into different things completely. Like I've never seen that, and granted I haven't read a lot, but that felt very unique to me.
I did actually, because when I brought up the like powers that manifest at a certain age, I feel like there was also a point when they mentioned that like if she hadn't lost all of her blood and basically redrank all of Castiel's, she would have been something different.
Right.
She would have potentially survived the culling, but she would not have been a god. But because she took his blood specifically.
Yeah.
And so there is also like, it's not just like, yes, there's the element of like, there's kind of like a maze when you're trying to figure out like this leads to this, which leads to this, which can sprout these, like, and all like, and they're connected this way. But like, she could have been one thing, but because it happened during the culling, it turned into a completely different thing.
Right. It was all like everything. It was very timing.
And like kind of, chance played a big role in that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also really with Serpent and Dove, like I found that world just really harsh, really interesting in the ways in the ways the authors use powers to move the plot forward. You know, like when you need to expend a lot of energy.
Yeah.
in different people.
It's a plot device.
Yes.
Like I can understand sometimes when people get annoyed with it, because I do think that some authors can kind of abuse that and use it as like a cop out with stuff. But when you're talking in like when you're writing within fantasy, magic and the way that it's expressed and like used within your universe is a plot device, whether or not people want to admit it.
Yeah.
And so like that is just how it's going to work out. And so like sometimes that is what's going to push the plot forward.
And books that are not fantasy or sci-fi don't do this. So it's like such a unique thing to fantasy.
And like, okay, so if we want to talk about needing to see sometimes like lose recklessness with magic, like just replace that with alcohol and you've got like a normal story.
Yeah.
And people wouldn't say that it's like, wouldn't say that about alcohol if that were the case. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So next week though.
Yes.
Do you know what we're talking about next week, Melissa?
Yeah, because I looked it up. Let me find it again. Just a second. Okay. So next week, you're going to actually be excited. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Next week, we are going to be talking about The Dispossessed.
Yes, by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yep.
This is our honorary classic of the season. And it is sci-fi written by Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a Portland author that has written tons of there's actually a ton of books in what's called the Hainish Cycle, which is all in one universe. And this, she has a lot of really popular ones, which is like The Lathe of Heaven or The Left Hand of Darkness are kind of her more popular ones. The Dispossessed was one that was given to us in class, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very political. She plays a lot with politics and revolution and anarchy and capitalism, and she also plays a lot with gender and fluidity and stuff like that. So it's really, her books are great. She's just a master. So I'm excited to read one for the podcast. Finally.
Yes, me too. This is my first Le Guin.
Yes.
So
Yes.
That'll be fun. I'm
Yeah.
happy to break this cherry with you.
Yes.
Pop it, break it. So aggressive. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm excited for next week.
Yes. All right. Until next time.
Mhm.
Happy reading.
Happy reading.
Bye.
Bye.